We have one more talk before our break. The title of the talk is Introducing OpenAPI-Driver and OpenAPI-libCore. Let's welcome to the stage Robin McKay.
Thank you. So, hello again. Robin McKay from the Netherlands, test automation engineer for Encore. So, more talk about APIs and open APIs. So, yay. A bit of a background here. This is a library I introduced half a year ago, I think, about that time. I've developed it at my previous employer, TKH Security, and they allowed me to open source it. A few reasons. The basic question to me was, okay, we're going to be re-implementing in C#, C++, this API, and we want to do that with an open API, so our customers can make their own interfacing, own tools that work on that API. So it must comply, the implementation must comply with the specification. So well, that's fine. And then the application itself has many screens. It was for an operator who watches security camera feeds. And then this was the first screen, and we already knew, okay, over the next few years, all the screens in the application need to move to that open API. So then you know, okay, this will be many endpoints. So very many test cases. So, and it's basically a contract test. So let's figure out what I can do. Now, once I've done this and it was released, I kind of realized like I need to refactor this, and then you have a second library. I'll get back to that. So API, open API. It has to do with APIs. Who's testing APIs? Yeah. Who doesn't? Yeah. So and then REST and JSON. Who's doing REST APIs? Most, right? And JSON, probably JSON REST, right? Yeah, thought so. Open API document. Anyone know what it is? No? Yeah, that's good. And the Swagger page. Who knows what a Swagger page is? Or actually the Swagger UI. So, who knows the relation between all these things? That's a lot of less hands. So let's get into that. Let's take a look. Open API, Swagger. So at one hand, we have the Open API specification. If you Google it, OAS. This is a description format for REST API. So we have our REST, we have an API. This is a standard, and it's an architectural standard mostly. So this is the one hand. Then we have Swagger. And if you Google that, you'll find like Swagger.io. This is a set of open source tools built around the Open API specification. So we have tools. So we have a standard and we have the tools. So if you see these terms being used somewhere, and if people are talking about the Swagger file or the Swagger page, they're talking about this Open API. The language confusion comes from the versions. Normally we talk now about version 3, version 2 is old, but version 2 was the Swagger standard. So it kind of was split, and now we have this. So look familiar? We can do guess the language, but in pretty much all languages, all frameworks, all examples, you see typical test cases like this. And I see some problems with that. At least when looking at this for TKH, I had a problem with this. Because there's a lot of them. Hundreds, sometimes thousands. Yeah. And that mostly means that our people spending like entire days working on your Swagger UI page, like, okay, try this on the endpoint, execute, oh, well, this doesn't work, try something else, and just going that. And then you start taking a successful thing that you did on the Swagger UI, and then you put that in a test script with all the boilerplate code that you need. And then they chase the endpoints. You do it again. Now, I was doing this for like, okay, we're going to re-implement this, doing, OpenAPI for the first time. This was daily basis. So we're thinking, would there be something else I could do? Is there an alternative for this? And then I started thinking, like, this OpenAPI document we have, it's the standard. What you see is sort of it's just JSON. You can open it in errors. You can look at it. Now, the Swagger UI page is generated code. It's generated from this OpenAPI document. So if you wonder, do I have this OpenAPI specification file? Well, it's there. It's just linked on a Swagger page. If you have a Swagger page, you have the file. You can click it, you have the content, you can save it, you have it available. So, Now, all the paths of your API are in the file. Everything you can do, post, put, get, for each path, it's in there. All the possible responses are in there. And then all the schemas for all the requests, all the schemas for all the responses. And then there's additional information like servers, security, examples. Everything about that API is in that file that you probably have access to. So we can test it. Everything is there for our test cases. And then I went with a data-driven approach. A path plus the method plus the response is a test case. You can go deeper than that, but for what I needed to do, check the specification versus the implementation, this was good enough. So we can generate them. Now there's this data driver library that you may know, use. And that's well suited for this because it's for data driven, it generates test cases and you can implement your own parser that determines how your test cases should look. So, and then each of these endpoints, each of the validations is very similar. You perform, you request, you have an expected result. There's not much more to APIs than doing that. Send something, get something back. If I send this, should be that. And all this information about responses and requests, it's there. So we can use a test template that data driver needs. Maybe we can just make one test case, one test keyword. well, so I just said everything you need to know is in that OpenAPI JSON. It would be so nice if that was entirely true, but it's not. Because there's room for interpretation there. Response codes for 1. You can always send a 200 on everything you do. It broke terribly, 200, it broke. It means okay, but then there's like 201, 202, 204, and when do you use which one? There are some rules for that, sort of, but it's not strict or enforced or anything. And then when you go to the 400, the error codes, it gets even worse. Like, what if a related resource is not found? Should that be 422, or should that be 404, or should it maybe be a 400? And then if I'm not allowed to do something that's not authorization-based, what should be the code? Yeah, you think of something. Implementation, whatever. What your developers decide, basically. So yeah. And then the more important one even is dependencies between the relationship you have. Like, we have this employee, and we need to pay employees, so they need to be in a wage group. They must be in a wage group. It's required. And that is a resource, so it has an ID. So that wage group ID must exist, otherwise I cannot use it creating an employee. Well, the OpenAPI specification has nothing for this. You cannot model it. It has to be true. You need to build this business logic in your API, but you cannot describe it. Well, you could technically do a documentation thing where you write, like, it must exist and you can find it here, but that's just human-readable text in a document that's used a lot for machine-to-machine communication. So there's nothing formal that a machine can use for this. So I needed a way, because this was happening in the API that I was testing. I needed something to capture this information and figure something out for this. So you can try to read this. Well, it's actually so real. But the idea is that it's possible to make a Python class, a simple class, follow some rules, where there's a relation between certain paths, an operation, toward an object that represents, has a link to the payload that you send or get. And I identified a number of typical relations. I made some classes for that you can then link in this way. And when it's executing, it will look at those relations, and you kind of model your business relationships like this. So now, that is what OpenAPILibDriver does. I decided not to go with live presentations or something like that. There's not much to see in the presentation, because it will just generate all these test cases, run them, and you have a report. Now, if you're really interested in that, you can fork the repo. If you have Poetry installed, Poetry install, inf test server, new shell, inf tests. There's your demo. Now, under the hood, we have OpenApiLibCore. I created this. I created and released OpenAPIDriver, and you start adding documentation, start covering new cases, and at some point your linters will be like, this class is way too big, you should not do this. So I started refactoring, and then I kind of realized, like, well, I have parts that are just for the data driver thing, but all this logic is generic and could be useful in other places for other people. And then also, there was some talk in the Robot Framework community. It's like, well, Matthäus and Bart are doing something with OpenAPI, and you are also doing something with APIs. Could this be useful to maybe? So I decided, yeah, I need to release this separately. So other library users, can start using these keywords that are under the hood for their own specific test cases. So the main aim that I see is custom libraries for that. It's a more technical library. But there are some keywords in there that might be suitable directly from test cases, because you can do things like, okay, just give the endpoint and give me an object that has randomized data for everything that needs to go into that request. And then you can modify that object and make your request. But you'll get a Python object, so I see it mostly useful in Python side. But because we're also doing like this REST thing has an architecture where if you say, okay, I have this users with a user ID, this user would be posted on the users part. So there's keywords like that get valid URL, because we need to go through a path with all these ID things to an actual URL with unreadable stuff in it. And if I do that for a path that has an ID in it, the framework library will just say, like, okay, to be on the safe side, maybe we're going to delete this, so let me try to create one for you. So go back, try the post, look it up in the spec. Okay, we can do this. Okay, we post it. And then you have the ID in that, and you give that back. And then you have your URL for a newly created resource that you didn't yourself create. It got created because you wanted that URL to use. So there's a number of mechanics like this in OpenApiLibCore. Now this was recently released. I plan on some additional keywords, like things to do partial requests with providing specific partial data. So say I have a user that I need to post, and it has 10 properties that I need to provide. But I want to test login functionality for a new user that requires only the username. So why do I want to put in an age, date of birth, home address? I don't care about that. I care about the name, so I want to specify the name in the post, in the test case, so you have it readable, not just generated and unreadable. And have a keyword that can do just that. Post user name Robin. Get back the ID, go to the website, log in Robin. Okay, this is first time new user, you need to provide a password, something like that. So that is how it can tie also into scenarios where you're doing API and website and go back and forth, stuff like that. What I've also just done is, it's a pre-release, I've added a faker library to the data generation. I want to add multi-language support to that. Faker does that. So then if you go like, okay, well, this field has a format that says it's a zip code. So you get your object and you get a Finnish zip code, or a Dutch one. If I want a name, well, maybe I want a Japanese name to test with. So I want to enable that. So we have some minutes before lunch. I don't want to keep you too long. So.
Thank you, Robin. Thank
Welcome.
you. Please post questions. We have one question at the moment, and I think you kind of touched this on a certain level during your talk. What is the difference to RoboSwag project?
Very good one, very good one. RoboSwag generates the Python classes that you can then use for your implementations. There's very good use cases for that. So it's really, of course, me and Matthias are talking. We might team up on certain things, but like this started with OpenApiLibCore, which is pretty much property contract validation. Just it does not, the data does not have to make sense. There's no business logic like checking pricers or what happens in databases. All that stuff is out of scope. It's just that it says I can get a 200 if I do this. Let's see it.
Yeah.
It should give me 422 when there's something not okay. Let's see it. So that's a different take on things, but it eliminates writing test cases. The test case file, the suite, is just this is the template, this is the keyword. That's all there's to it.
Yeah.
So different scope, but especially OpenApiLibCore is in the same corner, so to say. And I think we can really work together there and make it usable for test libraries, yes.
And then this is basically continuation on the previous question. What is the difference between your library and the other REST libraries available in Robot Framework world?
Yeah, we have REST instance and what's the other one? Yeah. So all these are pretty much wrapper libraries about the Python requests library. So you're really at an individual call level building up what you need to do. And these libraries abstract away from that. Are just not, I'm not interested in doing a URL. No, just give me one.
Yeah.
I go from the path to URL, and there's this logic things in there that assume it's a proper REST API that sticks to the principles, like, okay, users post creates a user with a user ID.
Yeah.
And request and all the wrapper libraries don't do that. You can put anything there and it will be executed.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered the discussion.
I'm sure. Will bearer authentication be supported in future?
I think in the repos there's a note about limited support for authentication. There's actually numbers of authentication already supported now. Might have to update that description. If you can create a request, a Python request authentication object, you can pass it to the library and it will be used. Because on the hood, it's just request calls being done. So it can use all the authentication that request itself supports. Recently, support for API keys was added by allowing custom headers that will be sent for every request. This is also where standards are a bit of a thing, bit of a problem. Like an API key is typically X API key that you need to send. The X stands for this is not standard, but everyone does it. And it's cap sensitive, and not everyone does that. So I went with like, give me something, I'll send it. And then that way API keys should be good.
Yeah.
And I think there's a thing to have bearer tokens that you can just provide the bearer token and it set the authentication header. So.
All right, thank you. Let's thank Robin once more.
Yeah.
Big thanks. Thank you for the awesome talk.